Hi and welcome to my video on Gesso 101. Why Gesso? Most of the canvases that you find out there, and especially cheap canvases, are covered with waxes, oil, etc. So paint won't coat or cover the canvas properly or even stick to it. You can see patches all over your canvas where the paint fails to stick. Even if the paint sticks, it'll be really light, which is hardly visible to the eye. Let me show you an example. This is a painting that I did years ago when I just started out pour painting. But back then, I did not have much knowledge about gesso, and I thought gesso was just too expensive for me to buy and use for pour painting. But I couldn't have been more wrong, because this painting turned out to be really beautiful, but it got ruined because of the lack of gesso on the canvas. Now if you watch closely, you can see patches out here. If you see in the other places, the paint has been absorbed quite well into the canvas and it looks beautiful and uniform. But these patches look really bad because the paint simply refused to stick to the canvas because of the quality of the canvas. Gesso is normally white and it makes colors appear radiant on the canvas. Also, raw canvases are like a sponge. It will absorb all the paints and pigments, and then you end up using more and more paints, which would end up being super expensive for you. It's a total waste of paint. This is where gesso comes into picture. Gesso helps you save paint. Blending the colors and stretching your paints become much easier when you gesso. Gesso simply means surface prep or surface prime. It's just like acrylic paints but much thinner, and you get both oil based and acrylic based gessos. Gessos are made out of three important things: binder, filler and pigments. Back in the days, gesso was made of binder, which was generally animal or rabbit skin glue, filler, which was chalk, calcium carbonate or marble dust, and a pigment, generally titanium dioxide. Gesso back then was definitely not vegetarian or vegan friendly. Rabbit skin was boiled in water to make glue, and rabbits were specially hunted in order to make gesso for artists. Most of the paintings that you see in the museum comprise of gessos made out of rabbit skin glue. But now it's evolved into something different. It's not only cruelty free and made of binders, fillers and pigments, but also has ingredients for protection and preservation to make your paintings archival or last long. Now why fillers? It is the filler or the calcium carbonate in the gesso that helps to grab the paints and the pigment by acting as a barrier between the paint and the canvas. So it is the fillers that would absorb the paint or the silicone oil or whatever medium that you use, and not the canvas cloth. Moreover, the gesso forms a protective shield over the canvas. Essentially, it stops the canvas from absorbing oil and other impurities. Let me show you an example. This is the same painting that I showed you before. And I used silicone oil in this painting. Now, when I flip the canvas, you can see patches here and there. This is nothing but silicone oil. Because I did not use gesso, the silicone oil did not mix well with the paint and has been absorbed completely in patches all around my canvas, and it has seeped all through the canvas to the back of the canvas. This is not good at all. I'll tell you why. Oil and other impurities which has been absorbed by the canvas and has seeped to the back will slowly deteriorate your canvas. After a while, mold might start growing on your canvas. Also, fillers are great because they improve the texture of your canvas and you won't have to work too hard with your brushes. This way, your brushes end up lasting longer. You save a lot of money on paints and brushes when you use gesso. As I said previously, binders in a gesso was made out of rabbit skin glue or animal glue. But nowadays they use PVC glue as binders in gessos. Gesso can even be made at home. All you need is PVC glue for binders, calcium carbonate, which is marble dust or chalk powder for fillers, and titanium dioxide or white paint for pigment. Now let's move on to how to make gesso at home. Now over here I have 3 ingredients with me. PVC glue. If you live in India, you can use Fevicol. Then I have some cornstarch. This is known as corn flour in India. And finally for pigments, flat white paint and primer by Bear or any house paint or Asian paints if you live in India. But make sure that it's flat white. Now when you use titanium white acrylic paint, make sure that you use an opaque titanium white paint and not a semi-transparent or transparent titanium white paint. How do you know whether the paints that you're using is opaque or transparent? For example, if you look at this Amsterdam paint, you can see over here that it's got a black square on it. And if it's completely black, that means it's completely opaque. But if you look at Artist Loft and look closely over here on the side, you can see that only half the box is black, which simply means that it's a semi-transparent paint and not an opaque paint. Now Amsterdam paints, Golden Fluid acrylics, Winsor & Newton and many other brands out there are highly expensive, which is why you don't want to use expensive paints to make your gesso, because your gesso would hardly be visible once your painting is done. Your painting would cover the entire canvas. So it is better to go for cheaper paints. So in order to make gesso at home, you need 1/4 cup of cornstarch or baking soda, 1 tablespoon of glue, 1 tablespoon of paint and some water. I will be teaching you how to make 1 ounce of gesso. You can scale it if you want to make it in bulk. I have 1/4 cup of cornstarch. I put it into my mixing cup. So to this I add 1 tablespoon of glue, PVC glue. Now I take my 1 tablespoon again and to this I add my paint and now start stirring it. At first you will see clumps. It'll look like biscuit dough, or it'll look like you're mixing dough to make naan bread. At this stage you have to slowly start adding water to it. Now don't add too much water, just add little by little. You can already see how just a little bit of water goes a long way. Keep stirring. Stirring is very important because you don't want to end up with lumps and clumps. I'm going to add just a little more bit of water. Look at this. This should be the consistency of your gesso. It should be the consistency of cold cream. And now you have perfectly smooth lump and clump free gesso. Take a lid and close your container so that it's airtight and you can use it for a long time. Now I'll show you how to make gesso with baking powder. For this, I'm using baking soda by Arm & Hammer. So I put 1/4 cup of baking soda powder into my cup, mixing cup. Then I take my 1 tablespoon. I add PVC glue or Elmer's glue all to it. And I pour it on top of my baking soda in my mixing cup. Now to this, I add my pigment, which is 1 tablespoon of house paint, flat white. And now it's time to mix. If you observe, when you used cornstarch, the consistency at first before adding water came out like biscuit dough. But if you notice that I've used baking soda and all the ingredients in the same proportion, but this is much smoother. I didn't get a biscuit dough consistency. I got a smooth consistency straight away. Because of that, we will not be needing too much water in this. You probably don't need any water at all. The reason why you won't be needing any water at all is because you need to maintain the texture of the baking soda. The grains or the texture of the baking soda is what will enhance the quality of your gesso. This is the consistency that you need to achieve while using baking soda. I did not use more than 3 drops of water. If you look at it closely, you can see the grains of the baking soda. Gesso made out of cornstarch should give you a cold cream consistency, whereas gesso made out of baking soda should give you the consistency of whipped cream, which is not too stiff. And just close it with the lid in an airtight container and you're good to go. Always use distilled water and not tap water. The reason for this is tap water has microbes in it. Let's move on to the next part. Let's talk about different kinds of gesso. You have normal gesso and heavy body gesso. Then you have student grade gesso and artist grade gesso. And of course you have your black gesso and clear gesso. Heavy body gesso is usually used for creating texture on your canvases. It is very similar to golden molding paste. The next thing you have is student grade gesso and professional gesso. This one is a student grade gesso, whereas this is a professional grade gesso. Now there isn't much difference between student grade and professional grade. Student grade is of course less expensive than the professional grade. The professional grade gives you a smoother finish without much brush strokes on your canvas. Now let's talk about black versus white gesso. The underlying color of your painting does matter because light falls on the paint and on the canvas, and then it gets reflected to show you what you see on the canvas. Not all paints are opaque. You have transparent and semi-transparent paints too. And how they appear to your eye depends on the color of your canvas. For example, if you want to paint a sunset, it appears much better on a whiter canvas than on a black one. The black works much better for opaque paints. Then you have something called clear gesso, When you do portraits or paint landscapes, you might want a warm or a cool undertone to your skin color on your portrait or to the sky or the background of your landscape. Which is why you have clear gesso, so that you can mix whatever color you want in it and give your painting an undertone. For example, if you're painting a landscape with a grey house, if you paint it over a white gessoed canvas, the grey will appear completely washed out. But if your canvas is yellow or yellow gessoed, the grey will stand out and so will all the other colors. And your painting will end up having a warm undertone. Similarly, if you're painting a forest, go for a blue or a light green gesso, so your painting will have a cool undertone to it. If you like a certain colorful background that you want to paint on or add more designs to it, but if it has a lot of pits and scratches on the surface, you don't want to use pigmented gesso over it because you do not want to lose that pretty background. Then what do? You use clear gesso. That way your colorful background will stay intact and also the damage and the scratches on the surface will be gone. For example, take this painting. Look at this background. Now I want to stencil some pretty embellishments over this canvas because I like this background a lot. But it's difficult for me to do my stencil work because this has a lot of deep lines, pits and cracks. So what do? I prime it with clear gesso. That way my background stays intact but I get a smooth surface and then I can embellish this canvas with my stencil work. Now back in the days around 15 years ago when I was an art student in India, my art teachers didn't teach us about the concept of gesso. Instead, whenever we started our paintings, they suggested that we use acrylic paint to prime our canvas instead of gesso. Even now, a lot of people use acrylic paint alone to prep and prime their canvas. Now let's make a comparison between acrylic paint and gesso. So for this illustration, I took a black canvas and I gessoed one side with Amsterdam acrylic white paint, titanium white paint. And I gessoed the other side with Liquitex Professional Acrylic Medium Gesso. So this side has acrylic coating on it. This side has a gesso coating on it. Now when we make a comparison between the two, the acrylic paint as a gesso has a white board-like feel to it, whereas gesso has a chalkboard-like feel to it. Acrylic paints are cheap, so it's a plus point, especially when you're a beginner or if you have a limited budget. But the negative is that it has a gloss or a semi-gloss finish. The way to overcome this problem is by going for house paint primer with matte finish or flat white instead. Otherwise, you will get a lot of reflection on your canvas, and also gloss will prevent your painting from blending or sticking to the canvas. If you want to stick to acrylic paint instead of gesso, then just get the cheapest matte or flat white out there. But always remember one thing though, gesso dries even faster than acrylic paint. This is beneficial especially when you have time constraints or when you work on huge canvases. Gesso also helps to preserve canvases and can be used on any surface. It has multi-purpose uses and is textured. Now let's test how paint reacts on gesso versus acrylic paint versus on a canvas without any gesso. Let's start off with solid colors. Now, if you look closely, what do we observe? We observe that the solid colors on the gesso appears to be more brighter and pops out than the solid colors on the acrylic paint or on the ungessoed canvas. You can also observe that in the ungessoed canvas, you can see spots of white in all the paints. It's not smooth. You don't see a smooth line of paint. Whereas if you look at the paint on the gesso or on the acrylic paint, you can see that there are no white patches. The lines of paint are completely smooth. Now there isn't much difference between the gesso and the acrylic paint. That's because I've only given one coating of gesso on top of the canvas over here. But if you give two or more coating, it would make the colors appear even more brighter than how it looks right now. Another thing that I noticed while doing this experiment is that when I moved my brush against the gesso or the acrylic paint, my brush just flowed smoothly across the canvas. But over here I had to add extra pressure in order to smear my paint across the canvas. Now let's try blending. Now you can see I've tried to blend the colors in all the three samples. I've used the same amount of paint in my brush for each sample. I observed that my brush flowed beautifully across the canvas when I tried to blend the colors, when I was using it on top of the gesso and the acrylic paint. But that was not the case with the unprimed canvas. Also, if you see, I used the same amount of paint for all the three samples. You can see how bright the one with the gesso looks. The one with the acrylic paint also looks quite bright, but the gesso looks the brightest. But if you look at this canvas, you can see how the paints look so transparent. They don't look solid or opaque. This is what I meant by saying that unprimed canvases soak in a lot of paint and you end up using more paints when you used an unprimed or ungessoed canvas. So that concludes my illustration on gesso versus acrylic paint versus unprimed canvas. Now we move on to how to prep, prime and prepare your canvas for painting or pour painting. So the first step to prep any canvas is flipping the canvas on the other side and taping the back side with painter's tape. So make sure that the back side of your canvas is completely sealed with painter's tape so that when you do your painting or pour painting, the back side of your canvas doesn't get damaged. The next step is to sand your canvas, because most of the canvases, level 1 canvases and cheap canvases, are not properly primed. There might be bumps here and there or patches where there isn't any gesso or primer at all. Over here I have a piece of sandpaper of 4000 grit. And remember, when it comes to buying sandpaper, higher the grit, the smoother is the surface of the sandpaper. So take a 4000 grit sandpaper and sand the canvas lightly. Then dust it off. The next step is to take a sponge and lightly dampen it. Don't wet it too much, just lightly dampen your sponge. And take the smoother side of your sponge and go over the canvas. Wipe it. When you wipe it, your canvas shouldn't be wet to touch. It should be slightly damp but not wet. Doing this will remove any dust which is on the canvas. Wait for a couple of minutes. Touch your canvas. It should be slightly dry. Now take a good synthetic brush in order to gesso your canvas. And now I'll be teaching you how to gesso. So now that you've splattered the gesso all over your canvas, take your brush and start working vertically. When you start, don't worry about getting brush strokes on your canvas. Just concentrate on evenly spreading the gesso all over the canvas. Now that the gesso is spread evenly across the canvas, it's time to get rid of the brush strokes. Take your brush and make sure that you slowly go across each and every section of the canvas slowly. Repeat this for a couple of times until the canvas turns smooth. As you can see, there are no brush strokes visible now. Then slowly lift your canvas and work on the sides of the canvas. Now wait for this to completely dry in order to give your second coat. Meanwhile, make sure that you wash your brush between each coat of gesso and dry it thoroughly because the brush has to be dry before you do your next coating of gesso. Now brush maintenance is very important. The reason for this is because you want your brushes to last for as long as possible. Brushes are expensive and you don't want this to be a recurring cost. I'll show you what happens if you do not wash your brush or maintain it properly after each coat of gesso. Check this out. Can you see how stiff it is? This one doesn't even bend. It's so stiff. Now the reason for this is gesso is made out of binders and most of the binders is nothing but your PVC glue, and when the glue dries on your brushes get spoiled. Now while we wait for this to dry, I'll show you another benefit of using gesso. Now if you look at this canvas, I made a very bad pour. It was an experiment and it failed really bad. I do not want to throw this canvas away, but I cannot use this canvas or paint on top of it because I used acrylic pouring medium along with my acrylic paint, and it's very dark and it's very difficult to do anything on this canvas, which is where gesso comes into picture. If I gesso this canvas, I can definitely paint over it again. Let me show you how. Take a 4000 grit sandpaper or 5000 grit and sand it first. Sand the sides too. Now why did I sand this canvas? I sanded this canvas for two reasons. One is to remove any unwanted texture which was on top of it, and the other reason being sanding the canvas will make the surface of the canvas slightly rough and porous, which will give a good grip for the gesso to stick onto the canvas. And I start with a similar fashion. First, I spread my gesso all over the canvas to make sure that there's complete coverage. And now that I have complete coverage, all I have to do is work on my brush strokes. Smoothen it out. As you can see, there are bits in my canvas. Then I gesso the sides. As you can see, I've gessoed the canvas completely, and now we have to wait for it to dry before I give the second coat. And okay folks, so it's been 20 minutes now and the gesso has dried on my canvas. So now it's time to do the second coat. But before that, I want to talk to you about something. If you remember, this was an already existing pour on top of which I put my gesso. But the thing about this pour was that it did not have any silicone oil mixed with the paint. Now what would you do if your already existing painting has silicone oil in it? Can you gesso on top of it just like that? No, you cannot. Let me show you an example how to gesso a canvas with silicone oil mixed with the paint on it. If you look at this pour has paints with silicone oil mixed to it. So before I even sand and clean this canvas, I have to remove my silicone oil. All you need is 50% rubbing alcohol and a piece of cotton. So you take your cotton pad and you add some rubbing alcohol to it like this. Make sure that your cotton pad is fully saturated. Now take this cotton pad and gently wipe over this canvas and on the sides too. Now you can see that all the silicone oil is off the canvas and on my cotton pad. Now you do not have to wipe it clean because rubbing alcohol evaporates on its own. So now you wait for a few minutes for the rubbing alcohol to evaporate. And once the rubbing alcohol evaporates, then you can sand your canvas and then clean it with a sponge, and then you're ready to go for gesso. Now we are back to our canvases for our second coating. So before you do your second coating, always take the sandpaper and lightly, gently sand your canvas. Similarly, I sand this canvas too. Now I dust it off. And I lightly sponge my canvas. Very lightly. Now if you remember, we gessoed the canvas vertically. So for the second round of gesso, we turn our canvases this way. And then we pour some gesso on it. Then we take our brush and repeat what we did during the first coat. So first I'll be spreading the gesso evenly across the canvas. Now that the gesso spread evenly across the canvas, I again take my brush and go slowly over it vertically. If you observe, I am gessoing the canvas in the opposite direction to how I gessoed during the first coat. Now I touch up on the sides. And this time I don't have to lift my canvas while I touch up the sides. Now why do we move the canvas to a 90-degree angle and gesso it during the second time? This is only to make sure that you have absolutely no brush strokes at all. Now if you look closely, you can see how smooth and even the canvas looks. There are absolutely no brush strokes. Normally, I would just recommend 2 coats of gesso. But if you want a third coat, then just repeat the process after 20 minutes. Now once this canvas dries, it's good to go. You can start painting on it. So folks, this is how you gesso a canvas. Now I'll show you how to prepare your canvas before you do a pour painting. General rule of pour painting is that you use at least 3 or 4 colors in order to do your pours. So out of those 3 or 4 colors, pick out one dominant color. For example, if I'm using ochre yellow, orange and phthalo blue to do my pour, I would want one color to be a dominant color. So in this instance, I would choose orange to be my dominant color. So I take this brush that I got from Home Depot and I put some orange paint on it. And then I go over the sides of my canvas. Now you don't have to paint your entire canvas. I just take my brush and go over the side of the canvas on the surface, and then on the sides of my canvas, and then on the edges of the canvas. And I let it dry. Now that my canvas is prepped, primed and prepared, I can just go and start doing my pour on it. Before I move on to the next topic, I want to show you an example of why you should prepare your canvas for the pour painting. Why paint the sides and the edges? Now when you do pour painting, especially with paints and medium of a runny consistency, what happens is the paint will start pulling off the edge of the canvas and it will not cover the sides of the canvas properly. But all these patches on the sides and the edges and on the side of the surface would ruin a very good pour. But the design or the pour in the center of the canvas might look exceptional. Now you don't want that, which is why you prepare the sides of the canvas, the edges of the canvas and the side of the surface of the canvas before you do your pour. And most of the time there would be enough paint to cover the entire canvas. So even if you pick a dominant color from your swatch, it is not going to be visible. Only little parts of it would be visible, and that would look like a part of your pour or part of your painting. It won't look as though you prepared your canvas in advance. It'll save you a lot of heartache from ruined paintings, trust me. So always prepare your canvas. Let's move on to the next topic, which is there are different companies and different brands that sell gesso. Each brand has its own speciality and there are different types of gesso available out there. Apart from different brands and different types of gesso, you also have professional grade gesso and students grade gesso sold by each brand. There are brands out there like Krylon that even sell gesso in aerosol cans. All you have to do is spray paint your canvas with the gesso. Then of course people use unconventional products to prime and prep their canvas or gesso their canvas. For example, people use Rust-Oleum to spray on their canvas as a gesso. Now over here I have Liquitex Professional Acrylic Medium. I have Liquitex Basic Student Grade Gesso. I have my homemade gesso made out of cornstarch. I have my homemade gesso made out of baking soda, And I have Rust-Oleum Ultra Cover Paint Plus Primer, flat white. Now let's compare all the gessos to see which one is the best. This one has the professional gesso by Liquitex and this one has the student grade gesso by Liquitex. Now when I compare the two, I don't see much difference at all between the two. I've given 2 coatings of gesso in each swatch. What I observed was one coating of Liquitex professional gesso was equal to 2 coatings of Liquitex student grade gesso. This one was the fastest to dry amongst all the gessos. Both of them are flat white, but this looks even more brighter than the student's grade. Another thing that I observed when I mixed water with my Liquitex professional grade gesso was that it worked just like my Liquitex student grade gesso. I can confidently say that Liquitex student medium gesso is just a slightly diluted version of the Liquitex professional grade gesso. Now I move on to my homemade gesso that I made with cornstarch. This one was the worst amongst everything. Now if you observe closely, you can see cracking all over the surface. Can you see? These are all cracks on the canvas. I've added 2 layers of gesso in each swatch and I've sanded the first layer of gesso before adding the second layer of gesso across the board. I am sure that this wouldn't even last weeks or months. In fact, I don't think you can even paint on it because as you keep painting on it, the gesso will keep peeling off the canvas. Now look at this. Look at this tape over here and you can see the gesso over it. The gesso made out of cornstarch and you can see it's full of cracks and it's very brittle. It just disintegrates in your hand like powder. So this is not at all a good option. But I would not be using this, nor would I recommend my viewers to use homemade gesso made out of cornstarch or talcum powder. Moving on to the gesso made out of baking soda, I loved it. I absolutely loved it. It's nice and smooth and it's got a chalkboard kind of a feel. And I like this texture more than I like the texture of Liquitex Basic Student Grade or Liquitex Basic Professional Grade. These are nice and smooth, but this feels like a surface that I would actually want to paint on. Now I'm sure you noticed that these two colors look more different than these two. That's only because these two are made out of flat white house paint, whereas these two are made out of white titanium dioxide pigments, which is why the difference in color. Finally, we move on to Rust-Oleum Ultra Cover Paint and Primer. Now, this is a very convenient way to prime and prep your canvas. When you use Rust-Oleum 2X Ultra Cover Paint and Primer, you do not have to worry about brush strokes and coverage. You have to just place your canvas upright in a vertical position, leaning against the wall, and then spray paint your canvas. But one thing though, you have to shake the can thoroughly before you spray paint your canvas. Don't directly spray on the canvas. Spray some primer on the wall or on a piece of paper first and then go ahead and spray on your canvas. One observation though, if you look at the Rust-Oleum paint and primer spray, it is slightly glossier than all the other gessos. And this one is the slowest to dry amongst all. Now let's move on to an experiment to see how paint reacts with different kinds of gesso on the canvas. First, I'll be making some solid strokes with semi-transparent paint and opaque paint across the board, and then I'll be showing you some blending to make our comparison. Now let's talk about observation. My most favorite gesso was surprisingly the homemade gesso with baking soda on it. My paintbrush just glided across the canvas effortlessly. Not only does the solid strokes appear nice and opaque, but also my blending. Here is a close-up. Look how smooth the blending looks when compared to all the others. This is the one with cornstarch. This is Liquitex Students Grade Gesso, and this is Liquitex Professional Grade Gesso. You can see that the texture of the canvas is visible below the paint. And also, if you see my blending strokes, you can see the brush marks. You can see the dark zigzag lines in between the paint. I pretty much used the same amount of pressure and same brush strokes over here too. But if you see, those zigzag lines or the pressure points of the paintbrush are hardly visible to your eye over here on the gesso that you made out of baking soda. The blending looks so much smoother and even. Now look at the solid colors. They look quite opaque, and I used the exact same amount of paint on my paintbrush for each swatch. Look how bright and how thick it looks on my canvas. Whereas this is awful. I have no words. You can see white patches everywhere and it just didn't work. The one with cornstarch. Liquitex Professional Medium. It's like the solid lines are smooth and even throughout from start to finish. Now I wasn't too happy with Krylon Ultra Cover paint and primer. This is something that I would go to as a last resort, but I would not make this my primary choice of gesso. This was just one step better than the gesso with the cornstarch. These two are the worst. 2 coats of gesso made out of baking soda was sufficient, but I think you need at least 3 coats or 4 coats of gesso to get this effect over here too. Blending with baking soda as a gesso almost gives you a watercolor effect. Like imagine watercolor effect while using acrylics. It's that good. You can also observe how a little bit of paint goes a long way when you use good gesso or when you put gesso over your canvas. I used the same amount of paint in all the 5 swatches, but the paint looks bright and the best in the gesso made out of baking soda. So bear one thing in mind: if you use Liquitex Students Grade Gesso or Liquitex Professional Gesso, make sure that you coat your canvas with at least 3 or 4 layers of gesso, especially when you're using a level 1 canvas. When it comes to these kind of gessos that come in bottles or jars, don't shake them before use. Place them on the ground and roll them nicely. The reason being, this will prevent air bubbles. Now we move on to the final part of our video. We've concluded that we do indeed need gesso to work on canvases, and that's because canvas is made out of cloth. But do other surfaces need gesso on them? Now let's find out. In this experiment, I'll be doing pour painting over 3 different surfaces: a glass surface, a wooden surface, and a metallic surface. Now if you observe, I've just gessoed 1/2 of each surface. I'm doing a flip cup pour and I've added silicone oil to each cup. Now let's do the flip. Now let's swirl. Now I'm going to use my heat gun to pop the air bubbles. Wow, look at those beautiful cells. Now we wait for 24 hours for this to dry, and then we can talk about our observation and compare both the sides of each painting. So folks, it's been 24 hours now and we have the dried results. Let's talk about observation. Now the first thing I want to tell you is pour painting always dries darker than it appears on the canvas when it is wet, which is why we have to wait for 2 weeks for it to fully cure and then varnish or finish it. That way it would look exactly like how it looked when it was wet. But right now it looks really dark, but that's normal. That happens to all your pour paintings. Now let's talk about the glass. So I had to redo this pour. Now the reason being, gesso is not usually meant for glass. You can gesso on the glass, but gesso is meant for glasses of particular shapes or unique shape. Since this was a flat surface, I don't think gesso was meant for this. The second reason being, before you gesso on glass, you should always sand the surface of the glass with a 500 grit sandpaper. So now what happened was, when I did my pour painting, after a while the half with gesso on it, this half completely congealed and caused cracks. So I had to wipe off all the paint and the gesso and redo the entire piece over here. As you can see, this is the half with gesso, this is the half without gesso. Now if I have to talk about the differences, you can see the texture of the glass through the bottom half, which does not have gesso, but the top half is clean and smooth. The texture of the glass is not visible through the paint. And also the paint appears brighter on this half, the gessoed half, than on this half over here. Usually people do not gesso glass because glass has specific paints available just for it. But when you do acrylic pour painting, you won't need gesso if your paint and your pouring medium mixture is nice and thick. But if you're making a pour with a very thin consistency of paint and pouring medium, then you will definitely need gesso on your glass. Next we move on to our wooden surface. Now if you observe the wooden surface, I like the half without gesso on it rather than the half with gesso. The cells look beautiful and intact on this side, whereas on the side with gesso the cells stretched as they dried, and then it resulted in some muddying over here. Another difference that I observed between the two sides was that in the side without the gesso, the surface of the wood is visible through the paint. If you see woods have lines on them. Those lines are visible through the paint on the side without gesso. If you look carefully, observe carefully, you can see the lines of the wood over here. It's texture free because wood does not have a texture, but it's got bright lines on it or rings. Those are visible through the paint. But on this side, that is not the case. It's not visible because this side has gesso. Finally, we move on to metal. And here are the results. So this half has gesso on it and this half does not have gesso on it. So when it comes to metal, gesso only works on very few metallic surfaces. It doesn't work on most metallic surfaces. And again, when you use gesso on metal, you have to sand it with a 500 grit sandpaper before you gesso. As you can see, the paint appears much brighter and more profound on the side with gesso on it. A lot of people told me that when they saw me doing the pour, that they liked the pour before I used my heat gun on it. I use my heat gun on it because I like a lot of cells on my painting. But if you don't want so many cells, and if you only want very few cells or the look that my painting had before I used my heat gun on it, then torch your painting with a kitchen torch. Don't use a heat gun. Now for a bonus, I had some leftover paint, so I decided to experiment on a canvas. Now this half of the canvas is gessoed, whereas this half of the canvas is not gessoed. So now let's talk about observation. Look, if you look closely, you can see how bright and beautiful the colors look on the gessoed half of the canvas. Whereas when you look at the bottom half of the canvas, which is not gessoed, you can see it is slightly muddy. The second thing is look at the coverage. The paint has been absorbed evenly on the canvas by the gesso. Whereas if you look at this, the half without gesso, you can see how the white part of the canvas is visible through the blue paint. This happened because the canvas absorbed too much of the blue paint and there wasn't enough blue paint to cover the entire part, which is why you can see the white part of the canvas through the blue on the ungessoed side. Also, if you look at the sides, it is beautiful and uniform. Whereas if you look at the sides over here on the ungessoed side, you can see white spots or white patches. Whereas that is not the case on the gessoed side. We did conclude that we do indeed need gesso in order to paint on canvas. But do we need gesso for pour painting? I would say definitely yes. If you want to avoid patches of white showing through your pour, then I would say please go ahead and gesso your canvas. You don't need 2 or 3 or 4 layers of gesso when you do your pour painting. For pour painting, it's sufficient if you just use 1 layer or 1 coating of gesso on your canvas. And also for pour painting, you do not need thick gesso. You can mix your gesso with water and make a light coating. That would be more than sufficient. So that's it, folks. Thanks for watching my video on Gesso 101. If you found this video to be informative, please click on like and subscribe. Share this video with your friends and family. Stay tuned for my next video on pouring mediums and how to make pouring medium at home. Bye.